Here we are, Tuesday, June 27th, 2023. I'm Larissa, and I'm going to continue reading When It Becomes Too Much, an original piece of fiction by me. Chapter 3, A Lot of Nothing. When Ruth finally put her key in the front door, her hair was damp and sticking to her neck and face. It was warmer out than she thought, and it was still early afternoon, so there had been little shade on either side of the street. The smell of the potato water struck her senses as she opened the door. She hadn't cleaned up in the kitchen earlier, other than to put the rest of the mayo in the refrigerator. The reminder of the potato salad was like an insult. Her cell phone was beeping, letting her know she had a text message. It was from Brian. "Where'd you go?" he was asking her. Ruth put her purse on the seat of her grandma's rocking chair and flopped down on the sleeper sofa she was still making payments on. "I just wanted to be alone," Ruth texted back. "You at home?" Brian asked. "Yeah, I need a nap. Call you later." "Okay, later." Ruth tossed her cell phone towards her purse and missed. The phone fell to the floor in front of the old chair. The light on her answering machine was blinking. Someone had left her a message. She got up and crossed the room to the island between the living room and small eating kitchen and pressed the play button. It was Tom from the office. "Hi, Ruth, it's Tom. Tom from work. I know things happened kind of fast this morning. If you want to come back in tomorrow and accept your promotion, you just need to show up. We can pretend this morning didn't happen. The potato salad was great as always, Ruth. Hope to see you tomorrow. We all do." There was no way Ruth was going back to that soul-sucking job tomorrow. Not after she got her toes painted gold like that. No one at the office would give a shit what color Ruth's toes were, but she knew things were different now, and there was no way she was going back to that place to be Ruth the shitty office manager Debbie replacement. Especially not without Brian. That would be too much. Besides, she didn't believe there was anyone at the office that cared one way or the other if she showed up in the morning. Tomorrow would go on much like every other day did, in spite of whether Ruth was there or not. Besides Brian, there wasn't anyone Ruth could think of that gave her a thought if she wasn't standing right in front of them, and even then, most people behaved as if she wasn't there. The police sure had treated her like she wasn't worth their time when the attack happened. They hadn't even taken pictures of the wound. She was the one who had taken photos with her phone and emailed them to the police station. Ruth ran her palm over the scar on her right clavicle and licked her teeth. In the kitchen, Ruth cleaned up the mess from the morning. She dumped the cloudy potato water down the sink and washed the dishes on the counter. Then she wiped the counter down and fished a wine glass out of the cupboard. On the refrigerator door was the bottle of rosé she and Brian had opened with dinner a couple nights before. There was one glass left in the bottle and she wanted it. Ruth blew the dust out of the bottom of the wine glass and filled it with the pink wine and took a sip. Still okay. Then she opened her pantry and grabbed a box of water crackers. In the fridge she had a wheel of brie and a jar of olives. She arranged the items on a plate and carried them and her glass of wine back into the living room. The sun was starting to hang low on the horizon now and was casting shadows of the trees along the street in front of her townhouse. She opened the blinds and cracked the double-paned front window allowing the sounds of the street to fill the space with her. Ruth sat on the couch sipping and nibbling while she watched cars and folks out walking pass by. Now and then she'd hear a piece of conversation. She felt very removed and far away, though the people passing by were in reality no more than 16 feet in front of her. From time to time, one could look in her window and see her sitting there on her couch and look away embarrassed. Ruth finished the glass of wine and got up to look for a new bottle. She was pretty sure there was another one on the top shelf in the refrigerator not yet opened. She was right. She twisted off the twist cap and poured herself a double, tucked the bottle on the door where the other one had been, and went back to her now cool spot on the couch. Sometimes she thought she might go get a cat to keep her company, but then there would be a litter box to clean, and she wasn't interested. Brian complained about cleaning the litter boxes for his mom all the time. A dog was definitely out of the question, though sometimes the thought of protection was attractive. Ruth slipped her feet out of her sandals and pulled her legs up under her on the couch, the gold glittery polish snagged on the textured upholstery. She looked at her garish toes and laughed at herself. On anyone else, the gold polish wouldn't have been a big deal, but on Ruth, it looked ridiculous. She felt like it was all anyone was going to see next time she walked out her door. Ruth chugged her glass of wine, sat the glass on the table next to the half-eaten cheese, and leaned back on the couch, closing her eyes. She had slept well the night before, but now she was washed in fatigue. She didn't know if it was from the emotions of the day, the muggy walk home from Brian and Patty's place, or the wine, but she just wanted to close her eyes and not open them again. When Ruth woke up, it was dark out and the street was lit up by the lamp posts. There was a chill in the air now, and Ruth got up to close the window. The smell of unwashed human filled her nose, and then she saw him. A homeless man was camped under her window. Ruth couldn't see his face, but the smell was familiar. She panicked. Her breath caught in her throat. She barely managed to get the windows closed. Her arms all of a sudden were weak. She picked up the landline and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? A man at my house. Ruth wasn't sure what she was saying. Ma'am, there's a man at your house? A man at my house? Ma'am, did you ask him to leave? Ma'am, we're dispatching a car to your address. There's a man. Yes, ma'am, stay on the phone with me until the officers arrive. Can you do that? Yes, there's a man at my house. It only took 5 minutes or so for the car to arrive. They must have been nearby. The homeless man was sound asleep and didn't even look up when the cops knocked on Ruth's door. Hey, they're here, Ruth croaked on the phone at the 911 operator and hung up. The cop knocked a second time, this time louder. The homeless man still didn't look up. Ruth reached out and opened the door. Did you call 911? The officer, a tallish man about Ruth's age, asked. He stood next to a much shorter woman officer with short hair and red lipstick. I called, Ruth said, clasping her throat with her right hand. She looked to her left where the homeless man still wasn't stirring and pointed. She stepped back and swept her arm, gesturing for the officers to enter her home. They did and closed the doors behind themselves. You said there was a man at your house? The male officer said. Ruth felt like she was ready to run a marathon. The blood was pumping in her ears and her pulse was racing. She began panting heavily, nearly hyperventilating. The female officer stepped toward her and touched her shoulder. Ma'am, maybe you better sit down. The female officer was guiding Ruth to her couch. Ruth sat, and the woman officer sat next to her, while her partner remained standing. He now had a notepad out and was starting to write something. Ruth looked back and forth between the two officers, and then back toward her window where the blind was still open. That man outside, he smells like the man who attacked me 10 years ago. Ruth finally got out of her mouth. The male officer looked up from his notepad. You were attacked and that man did it? He asked. No. I don't know. I didn't see his face just now. I only smelled him and was frightened and called 911. Ruth sputtered. The female officer got up and walked toward the door. I think I can take care of this right now, she said as she opened the door. She stood on the stoop and spoke towards the still silent homeless man. His face was tucked under his right arm. Hey, excuse me, sir, she said, bending over now to jostle the man. He was stiff. He rolled over, revealing waxy eyes and a dead body. The cop gasped and came back in the townhouse. Dan, we have a situation out here. He's dead. The female officer frowned and pointed toward the door. Oh, my God, Ruth cried. He's dead? Ruth ran to the window now, looking at the face of the man. It wasn't him. It wasn't the man who had stabbed her. It was just some other smelly homeless man who probably wouldn't have had any problem stabbing Ruth just like the other one. Thank God he was dead. Ma'am, please sit back down, the female officer instructed. Is it the man who attacked you? Officer Dan asked Ruth. No, it's not him. I wish it were, Ruth said as she sat back down on the couch. Do you know what time he sat down out there? Do you have any cameras? The female officer asked Ruth. Officer Dan was now squatting next to the dead homeless man's body, looking at him more closely. I don't know. I laid down to take a nap around 3:30, and I called when I found him right after I woke up. I don't have any cameras. What time is it right now anyway? Ruth was looking around the room and looking for anything with the time. The clock on the wall above the couch behind her said it was 8:10 now. The female officer looked out the window, then closed the blinds. She stepped outside but left the door cracked. Ruth craned her neck and listened to hear what she was saying to the other officer. There's an ATM across the street. It probably has a camera. We might see something on that. Ruth had forgotten that ATM was there. It was for a credit union. She never used it. Last winter, her neighbor, Mrs. Rabian, had been mugged using the ATM. There was a camera then. That's how they had caught the guy who had mugged Mrs. Rabian. Ruth called out to the female officer, I know that ATM has a camera. The female officer stuck her head in the door. Oh, okay, thanks, she said to Ruth. After a couple minutes, both the officers came back in to talk to Ruth. Dan did the talking. Ma'am, it may take a couple hours to get this taken care of. We can't move the body. EMS needs to come out and declare him dead, and the area is going to be taped off. Do you have any plans to go out tonight? Ruth looked at him dumbfounded. No, but I don't know. I kind of don't feel like being here right now. The female officer laughed under her breath. I understand that, but we are going to need you to stick around for a little bit and answer some questions. The whole ordeal took over 3 hours. They took down Ruth's information, then taped off the area, then they called it in, and they waited for the EMS and another 2 officers to arrive. They photographed the man where he lay and how he was positioned before the female officer had moved him. Then he was placed on a stretcher in a body bag and put in the back of the EMS van. Officers Dan and Linda told Ruth just before they left that they would be talking to the credit union about the camera in the morning and said she should plan on sticking around until they were able to corroborate her story with the camera footage. Ruth assured them she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. It was after midnight when Ruth was finally pulling back her sheets to get in bed. She had pulled fluffy warm socks over her golden toes to keep the polish from catching on the sheets all night. Her nightgown bunched around her waist as she rolled over onto her side and pulled the covers up to her shoulders. She was looking at her cell phone on her nightstand charging. She grabbed it and opened her text messages. She was a little surprised Brian hadn't texted or tried calling her. She texted him. Hey, you still up? What are you doing? She sent. It only took a couple seconds to get a reply. Yeah, I'm still up. OMG, what am I doing? Right now, a lot of nothing. After you left me, Janie and my mom did shots of tequila, and my mom and I got in a fight. Brian answered. Some homeless guy died on my stoop, Ruth said. What the fuck? Brian replied. OMG. Tell you all about it tomorrow. Cops just left a little while ago. I'm tired. I want to sleep. Okay, want me to come pick you up for breakfast tomorrow? Yeah, sounds good. Not before 10. Okay, see you 10-ish. Nighty night. Night. Ruth plugged her phone back in to finish charging and turned off the light on the nightstand and fell into a fitful sleep. Ruth's first night without a job was filled with crazy dreams. She woke up twice, not knowing where she was for a minute. She knew she had just been dreaming something, but both times the image dissolved with her awareness of her surroundings. The second time she got up and went to the bathroom. It was 6 a.m. according to the digital shower clock. After peeing, Ruth washed her hands and face and brushed her teeth. She was awake now. Down in the kitchen, Ruth started a pot of coffee like she would have done every other morning before work, but this morning was different. She was up but had nowhere to go. She opened her freezer and dug around into the backmost corner and pulled out a small container wrapped in layers of saran wrap. She began unwinding the plastic wrap. When she got down to the small Tupperware container, she struggled to get the lid off. It had been in the freezer for 5 years now. When she finally got it open, the pack of cigarettes inside went flying across the kitchen. And landed in the sink. Ruth scrambled, hoping there was nothing with standing water in the sink. She was pretty sure she had washed everything last night before bed, but things were a little hazy. The sink was empty and the cigarettes were safe. Ruth started smoking after the attack when she started attending a survivor support group. Everyone in the group smoked. She smoked like a chimney for years. She only quit because Brian said he wasn't going to hang out with her anymore because her hair smelled. She had one last pack of cigarettes left in the last case she bought, and she had wrapped it up and put it in the freezer just in case of an emergency. When she was sitting on the toilet earlier, she had decided it was an emergency. She hadn't even thought of the pack of cigarettes since the day she put it in the back corner of the freezer. Sitting on the toilet, she had the urgent craving for a Camel 100 Light. While the coffee brewed, Ruth dug around for her old ashtray and a lighter and some matches or something. She found a barbecue lighter in the junk drawer, and her old ashtray was in the drawer in the side table of the sleeper sofa she was still making payments on. Off the back of the kitchen, Ruth's townhouse had a small deck with a small table and chairs and Weber grill. The backyard was narrow and ended with the back of her garage, where her blue 95 Chrysler LeBaron was parked. She'd drive more often, but Brian didn't like riding in the convertible for some reason. Ruth gathered her cup of coffee, ashtrays, cigarettes, and barbecue lighter, and sat at the small table. The lemon tree she planted last spring was doing well in the middle of the small yard. It looked like it even had a few lemons ready to be picked. Ruth took a sip of the coffee and opened the pack of cigarettes and lit one. She took a deep inhalation, and it went down soft and smooth like she had never quit. Ruth ended up making 3 pots of coffee and smoking the entire pack of cigarettes. It was 9:30 when she pulled her cell phone from her robe pocket and remembered her breakfast plans with Brian. After all that coffee and the pack of cigarettes, she was anything but hungry. But that was okay. Ruth scooped up the mess in front of her and went into the townhouse to shower and brush her teeth again. She might need to brush them a few times after all the coffee and cigarettes. Brian was going to be appalled. Ruth dumped the full ashtray into the downstairs toilet and flushed. She had to flush 3 times to get all the butts to go down. Then she put the ashtray and the mug in the dishwasher. Brian was going to be there soon for sure. She wanted to at least be clean when he got there. Chapter 4. A lot of attitude. Ruth was drying her hair when Brian knocked on the door. She left her hair slightly damp and ran down the stairs to let him in. "Why does it smell like cigarettes in here?" Brian asked immediately when Ruth opened the door. "Well, nice to see you too. I don't believe I need to justify how my house smells to you," Ruth said boldly. She didn't usually talk back to Brian. He was used to being the one in charge in the friendship. "Whatever. So are you ready or what?" "Or what? I need to finish." "I'll be back down in a minute," Ruth said from halfway up the stairs. "Okay, but if we get there after 11, they won't serve us breakfast, so keep that in mind," Brian yelled as he poked around looking for the source of the smell. "I don't care. I'm not that hungry anyway," Ruth yelled over the hairdryer. Downstairs, Brian found the empty pack in the trash. He stomped up the stairs and confronted Ruth with the evidence as she was putting red lipstick on her mouth. Brian was holding the empty pack between his right thumb and index finger. Ruth made a kissy face at him. When did this start again? And since when do you own a red lipstick, let alone wear one?" "What? You like it, do you?" Ruth made another kissy face at Brian and twirled around in her red and white striped sundress. She stuffed her feet into a pair of red leather backless slides. Her gold toes glittered blindingly. "I didn't say that," Brian smiled. The dress looked nice and Ruth almost looked pretty. Almost. "Smoking is nasty. You're going to be old in like a week if you start smoking a pack a day again." Ruth made a grimace at Brian. "Look, they were my emergency pack. I hadn't smoked since I quit. I just had an emergency, okay?" Ruth was irritated with Brian when normally she would have been apologizing for offending his sensibilities. "Whatever, but no smoking in my car, okay? Or at my mom's place. She'll have a fit." "Well, I don't plan on going to your mom's place today, and I don't have any more cigarettes right now anyway, so you can just drop it, okay? You didn't have a dead guy in your front yard last night. You just got drunk and fought with a blind woman." Ruth was more forceful than she ever was. Brian was a little worried. Who was this woman, and what had she done with his friend? "Why don't you want to go see my mom?" Brian asked, offended. "I didn't say that I didn't want to see your mom. I said I wasn't planning on going to see her today. What is with you?" "Look, are we going for breakfast or not?" "Yeah, let's go." Ruth grabbed her giant hobo bag and slung it over her shoulder. Brian followed her down the stairs, dropping the empty cigarette pack back in the trash. He had forgotten about the dead guy and was feeling a little bad about judging his friend, but only a little. Smoking was gross. "Where are you parked?" Ruth asked, looking up and down the street. She didn't see the hooker buggy. "Oh, I'm just around the corner," Brian said, pointing toward the old office. He began to walk in the direction, and Ruth followed. "Where are we going, Steamers?" "Where else?" Brian replied. They had been having breakfast once or twice a week at Steamers for the past 4 years. "I was just making sure." Steamers was an old-fashioned diner, not a retro-themed diner, just an actual old-fashioned 24-hour greasy spoon with waitresses in uniforms who called their orders through a tiny window at a line of grumpy cooks. Brian liked breakfast and didn't want to be seated after 11 a.m. and be forced to settle for an egg salad sandwich when he wanted the big greasy, Steamer's famous breakfast special. They had 15 minutes to get there, park, and be seated before it would be too late. Ruth got in the car and buckled up. Brian floored it. They got there within 5 minutes to spare. Brian pulled his mom's handicap placard out of his bag and hooked it on the rearview mirror and pulled in between the blue lines next to the front door. "You're going to hell for that," Ruth joked. "Oh, I'm going to hell for a lot more than that. According to my mom yesterday, I'm going to hell for butt-fuckery," Brian said over the hood of the car to Ruth as she closed her door and stepped up to the door of the diner. The two friends slipped in the door and took the first two seats at the counter just in time for Brian to still have breakfast. Hannah, the oldest waitress at the diner, placed two breakfast menus in front of Ruth and Brian. "You're just in time, Brian. You want the usual?" Hannah said, pulling her pen and pad out of her apron pocket. "Yeah, and coffee, and orange juice, and extra cream." "How about you, Ruth?" Hannah turned towards Ruth, who was looking at the menu with a frown on her face. "Oh, I don't know. I'm not really hungry, but I could eat something," Ruth said. "Well, do you want breakfast?" Hannah asked Ruth. "No, I don't think I do." "Well, okay. Let me go get this order in, and I'll come back with a lunch menu for you to look at then. Stan will have a fit if I don't get this in right away. He told me absolutely no bending the breakfast rule today," Hannah said, walking toward the order window to call in Brian's Big Greasy. "Why aren't you hungry?" Brian looked over his right shoulder at Ruth, who was tapping her fingers on the counter, still frowning. "Oh, I drank 3 pots of coffee and smoked that whole pack this morning," Ruth said. 3 pots of coffee? Did you have to shave your tongue?" Ruth stuck her tongue out at Brian as Hannah returned, handing her a lunch menu and pouring Brian a cup of coffee. "Iced tea, Ruth?" Hannah asked. "Yes, please. No lemon." I know. Be right back with the tea and OJ." It only took a second for Hannah to grab the OJ and iced tea. There was a prepped tray of glasses of orange juice, and the tea machine was across the counter from Ruth. Hannah put the drinks on the counter and looked at Ruth, who had closed the menu in front of her. "I just want the cheese sticks and a side salad with oil and vinegar," Ruth told Hannah. "Okay, no problem," Hannah said and walked away. "Ugh, she forgot my cream," Brian complained. Ruth stood up and bent over the counter, looking at the shelves hidden behind, and saw a tray with bowls of creamers. She grabbed one and put it in front of the pouting Brian. "Here, now shut up and tell me about your fight with your mom." "There's nothing to tell. The 3 of us got a little drunk and Janie went home. Then my mom asked me why I didn't just ask you to marry me, and I flipped out. I don't know why. It's not like it's the first time she's asked me that. It was just too much with the tequila. I unloaded on her and she cried and told me I was going to hell for butt fucking and getting HIV. I swear sometimes I want to kill her." Brian sighed. "Yeah, she said something about you and I getting married to me before, too." "Yeah, I know. She asked me all kinds of questions about your family that time." You said she knew since you were little that you were gay. Why does she still push? It's not like she even goes to church." It was true. Patty didn't go to church anymore. Not since she went blind. She got tired of the pompous church women telling her she just wasn't praying hard enough for God to heal her. Then there were the group of women who started telling folks she was going blind because she liked to pleasure herself. Patty had taken that really personally because she was a widow and because she never pleasured herself, ever. She told Ruth once that the thought of touching herself made her feel sick to her stomach. Ruth didn't care. She hadn't even asked. It was a strange comment Patty had made out of the blue one time when they were all sitting around watching Patty's favorite show, Jeopardy! "She's just got the grandbaby itch. Her sister's stepdaughter just had her 3rd and called yesterday to brag to her about it. That's all. That's how the conversation started. She was telling me about the phone call and complaining that my aunt is mean." Hannah came and put the 4 plates that made up Brian's breakfast in front of him, and then hurried back to grab Ruth's order before the salad sat under the heat lamp too long and wilted. She put the 2 dishes in front of Ruth and smiled. "Do you need extra sauce for the sticks?" she asked. "Yes, please," Ruth answered. Hannah had been waiting on Ruth and Brian since they started going to Steamers. Hannah quietly came back with a small bowl on a dish and sat it to the right of Ruth's plate of fried cheese. "Well, at least your mom talks to you," Ruth said, dipping a stick into the marinara sauce and taking a bite. "Yeah, you got me there," Brian said, cutting the plate of pancakes topped with butter and syrup. He stacked his fork and shoved an enormous bite in his mouth. "I don't know how you eat that every time we're here," Ruth said as she poured the dressing on her salad, "or why you're not 1,000 pounds. That is the biggest, greasiest meal." It really was. The Big Greasy was a plate of 4 giant pancakes, a plate with a biscuit and sausage gravy, a plate with 2 eggs, bacon, and hash browns, and a plate of fried green tomatoes. One of the plates by itself was too much for Ruth. Brian always cleaned all 4 plates. To be fair, he normally didn't eat for the rest of the day after eating the Big Greasy. "You want one of these fried green tomatoes?" Brian picked up a thick sliced fried tomato and held it out to Ruth. He knew she liked them. "Yeah, sure," Ruth said and made some room on her plate next to the remaining 4 cheese sticks. Brian plopped the tomato on the dish and went back to stuffing his face. Ruth cut the tomato and took a bite, smiling. They're so good. My grandma used to make them, but these are even better than hers. Ruth's grandma had been on her mind a lot lately. She would have been angry at how Ruth's family had treated her after the attack. Grandma Pepper had been as spicy as her name and didn't tolerate anyone picking on Ruth. She and Ruth had been close. Pepper was her nickname. Ruth had been named after her grandma. So tell me about this dead guy, Brian said between bites. Oh, yeah, Mr. Dead Guy, Ruth said, rolling her eyes at the thought of the previous night. So I drank the rest of that wine from the other night and had some cheese and crackers and was people watching out my front window when I took a nap. Then I took a nap. Only it was more than a nap. I fell asleep for like 5 hours, and when I woke up, it was cold and dark. So I got up to close my window and smelled him before I saw him. Ruth paused and chomped on another cheese stick. Brian was now moving on the bacon and eggs and hash browns. He always saved the biscuit and gravy for last. He said it was like his dessert. When I looked down, I couldn't see his face. He just looked like he was sleeping there, and he smelled like the guy. You know, the guy. And I freaked out and called 911, and the cops came. Ruth wiped the corners of her mouth and took a drink of her iced tea. Wow, so you just called the cops because a homeless guy was sleeping in front of your place? Well, yeah, but he wasn't sleeping. He was dead, Ruth defended herself. Yeah, but you didn't know that. You just smelled him and had a flashback. Are you still going to that group? Brian asked. He knew she wasn't going to that group. It doesn't matter. He was dead. Anyway, the cops came and found he was dead, and then we had to wait for someone to come take pictures and pick him up. I was just getting in bed when I texted you last night. Why were you so tired yesterday? Brian asked as he stuffed the hash browns with hot sauce in his mouth. I don't know, emotional drain, I guess. Hannah came by and refreshed Brian's coffee and filled Ruth's iced tea. Hannah, can I get a Cobb salad to go with ranch dressing on the side, please? Sure, Brian. Hannah wrote the salad on a ticket. Any drink with that? No, Brian said. Mom has her Crystal Light at home. Hannah smiled and nodded. I'm not going back to your place with you. I told you I wasn't planning on seeing your mom today. I know, but why? Brian asked again. I just don't feel like talking to her. Honestly, if we hadn't made plans last night, I wouldn't have gone out this morning. I'm feeling kind of out of sorts. No kidding. You've been offering me a lot of attitude since you got those gold toes yesterday. Brian swirled 2 creams in his refreshed cup of coffee. A lot of attitude, huh? Well, maybe I just finally feel free to be myself. Ruth knew one thing. She was ready to go home. She opened her purse and took some crumpled cash out of a change purse and slapped it on the counter. I'm ready when you are, she said to Brian. He was just starting his biscuit. Take your time, but just know I'm ready to go home. Fine, Brian said, a little hurt sounding. Jeez. Yeah. So Brian and Ruth and Brian. Brian and Ruth and Brian. It's not easy being a hag. No, it's not.